Hello, it's me, Johanna, and I'm here today to do the last part of the Psych IA. So we'll be going through criterion 4 and also an example of how that section is supposed to look like. So this part is all about the discussion. In the discussion, you evaluate your procedure, you evaluate your results, you talk about what your findings actually mean and any improvements you could make or further research you could do in the future to make your investigation even more interesting. The three other parts to this series about the psychology IA will be linked at the end. So there are 6 marks available for this criterion, which is called evaluation. So to get those 6 marks, you first have to discuss your findings with reference to the theory or model that you were using to begin with. So you are replicating a study in this process. So whatever theory they are using, you are also using. So you discuss the results with reference to that. Then you talk about the strengths and limitations of your design, sample, and procedure. So you remember your design is the independent measures design, most likely. You might have used a different one, but it's most likely that. So you explain some limitations of that design. Your sample, you could be like, oh, I only had 16-year-olds. This is a problem because then we can't generalize to any other age group, or, something along those lines. Procedure, that could really be anything, and we'll get into an example very soon. So the last thing you have to do to get those 6 marks is that any of the modifications, so that means the improvements or further research that you are going to suggest to be done, needs to be explicitly linked to the limitations you just mentioned. So if you're like, oh, the design is bad because blah, 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 then your modification should be in reference to that. You should be like, oh, change to this design, because then you fix those problems that you mentioned before. Now we're going to look at an example from a sample essay that got 22 out of 22 marks. Feel free to pause the video and read these paragraphs before I actually start speaking about them. So as you can see here, the first 2 paragraphs that are shown here, this student has decided to get the points for the first part of the criterion that asks to discuss the findings with reference to the model or theory. So this first big paragraph after the heading of discussion, it basically says, this was the original study I looked at and my data supports what their data says. Like, it validates each other. So you say that, and then or you say that it doesn't. It's okay if your results are not the same as the original study. Actually, that's good. You have more to evaluate then. Just be clear to state that. So first you state, my findings line up with the findings of ... which other study you did. And then after that, you have to mention the specific model. So in this case, they said, this fits with the levels of processing theory. And that is as simple as it gets. You really just have to mention, this means this, this makes sense. And you might have to just explain it like a little bit. So in the next paragraph, they mention a strength, but they also mention a limitation. They say that despite doing this, it did not actually prevent the participants from not recognizing some of the words. And then they also explain how they would fix this the next time if they were to do this experiment again. So that's exactly what you need to do. You have to go, here's a strength, here's a limitation, this is how we'd fix the limitation. Now, the next paragraph after that, the last paragraph on this page that I'm showing here, they talk about some issues that are a bit broader. This is more of a issue that is throughout the whole experiment, not just like a 1 or 2 off case. Those are also very interesting to mention if you can think of any. However, it's okay. You just have to mention limitations. They don't have to be like super deep or interesting or anything. This student mentions a lot of different things, but I roughly counted the amount of limitations and strengths they mention. Basically, they mention 3 limitations and 2 main strengths. However, there are like some small things in between there. And I'm counting only the ones that they added a modification to for the limitations. So basically, another thing I want to say here, when it comes to your design used, because they mentioned design in here, it is very, very okay for you to say, there are some issues with this design, however, I would not change it because this other design would not be more appropriate for these and these reasons. That is also something I did in my own Psych IA, like personally, and I think that is perfectly fine because you're explaining, here's the issues, you could fix it by doing this, but that would also be negative because of these issues. Now here at the very bottom, they mention how it's hard to generalize because their sample was made up of only high school students. I think they could have been even more specific about that, like specifically only high school students between the age of dot and dot, or saying like they're all of one ethnicity, but sure, that's perfectly fine. It's a really easy limitation that you can mention. So the last two things the student writes about is about what types of things they could do for a future experiment. So they would say it would be interesting to test some other facets of memory other than simple recall. So you basically just explain, and you only need one example for future experiments. You don't have to come up with like a million different things. And then at the very end, you can write one sentence just saying, this is the conclusion. Like, you're essentially just repeating what you said before, but the very last sentence of your essay should say, from our results, we can conclude ... And then that is it for the psychology IA. At this point, you should be completely done with your essay. You might have to delete some words and stuff, depending on if you reach the word limit or not, which is 2,000 words. Goodbye. I hope you learned something, and I will make many more psychology videos in the future, so feel free to subscribe, like, and comment. Goodbye.